Okay, pushers out there. Let's go. I'm back at you. This is Mr. B History. Back at you with another way too informative round of notes. This time, the topic, the progressive era. When I say progressive, you say reform. What kind of reform? Political, economic, social. You name it, they want to reform it. This time period lasts from 1901 to 1917. We got a quote for Woodrow Wilson, but I ain't going to read it. Progressivism, reform. There's some underlying causes to some of this reform. A lot of this is dealing with the problems of the Gilded Age. Rapid industrialization, massive immigration, urbanization, monopolies and trusts, settlement of the West, segregation, laissez-faire, all created problems. Problems everywhere. And the government wasn't doing anything to fix these problems, and so the progressives want reform. But they did not want revolutionary change. They were not trying to overthrow society, unlike the communists and the socialists. They wanted to build on the existing society and use moderate political, economic, and social reforms or improvements, and they wanted the government to do the improving. Their goals were to limit the power of big businesses, i.e. limit the powers of monopolies and trusts, expand democracy, and expand social justice. Overall, they wanted a more active role for the federal government. The origins of progressivism. Progressivism started at state reforms. They actually started in the city and state reforms, and they become national with the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt. They continued on during the presidency of William Howard Taft and Woodrow Wilson. So basically, those are the three progressive presidents: Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. The progressive era came to an end by U.S. entry into World War I, which diverted our attention away from reforming things at home and instead getting involved in a world war. One of the effects of industrialization was a growing middle class. This growing middle class was, towards the end of the 1800s, was becoming alarmed by the rising power of big business, the uncertainties of the business cycle, boom and bust, cycle of speculation and then depression. The large gap between the rich and the poor. The rich were really rich and the poor were very poor, and the middle class was kind of scared of both of them. They were afraid that the rich was going to become too rich and the poor was going to become too poor, and that would cause conflict. Oh, speaking of conflict between labor and capitals, they saw this as another example that they needed to have some reform. Corrupt political machines was another target of the progressives. They wanted to get rid of the spoil system and the political machines. Some progressives, especially the civil rights activists who were progressives, they wanted to reform the Jim Crow laws in the South that enforced racial segregation. And women wanted the right to vote. So that was a reform that women wanted because women still didn't have the right to vote. The progressives, pretty much anyone who wants to reform is considered progressive. So it was a very diverse group, right? So there's all these different people that were held together by a common idea that the government was going to be the solution to the problems of the Gilded Age. The progressives included the urban middle class. These were white-collar workers, doctors, lawyers, and small business owners, the professional classes, and they were inspired by none other than a philosophy of the Gilded Age, which was the social gospel, which originated with Walter Rauschenbusch, which is a really fun name to say, Rauschenbusch. And it's WWJD, what would Jesus do with the problems of urbanization, industrialization, and immigration? And the answer is, he would help them. But what the members of the social gospel realized, like Jane Addams and her Hall House and her settlement houses that were supposed to help immigrants, was that as much as they could do, they couldn't help everyone, and they would need someone bigger than individuals. They would need the government to make the kind of reforms that they wanted on the scale that they wanted. Leadership. It didn't matter if you were Republican or Democrat. Progressives you could be a progressive Republican or you could be a progressive Democrat. It didn't matter as long as you wanted reform. Right, so some famous Republican progressives were Fighting Bob or Robert LaFollette, and Theodore Roosevelt was also Republican progressive. Democratic progressives included Williams Jennings Bryan. That's right, he was famous for taking on the plight of the farmers in the election of 1896, and then Woodrow Wilson. Their philosophy, it wasn't anything new. There's been a long tradition of reform going all the way back to the Jeffersonians versus the Federalists, the Jacksonians, and then most recently the Populists. The angry farmers wanted to reform all these things. They're committed to democratic values. That's freedom, equality, opportunity, and voting, honest government, and just laws. The progressives really, really like the idea of pragmatism, or the philosophy of pragmatism. Romantic transcendentalism that we saw prior to the Civil War is going away. Even rugged individualism is going to be traded for or replaced by pragmatism. Pragmatism means putting things into practice. So if it's pragmatic, it means that it's not idealistic. It's just, it works. So they were in favor of the scientific method, trial and error, and put things into practice, and whatever works is good. So it's a practical approach to morals, ideas, and knowledge. If it works, it must be good and true. So there you have it, very pragmatic. What the best they're trying to be is efficient as possible, which just brings us to scientific management. Fredrick W. Taylor, he uses a stopwatch to organize factory workers more efficiently, coordinating their movements down to the thing to become like as efficient as possible. This becomes known as scientific management. So the progressives take this idea of Fredrick W. Taylor's and how he improved workplace productivity, and the progressives want the government to be as efficient as some of these factories. And so the idea is that instead of being run by political machines, they should hire political experts and scientific managers to run the country. The muckrakers. The muckrakers. Muckrakers is a title given to investigative journals that expose the problems of the Gilded Age. So before any of these middle-class people could be upset and demand that the government do anything, they had to know about all the terrible stuff that was happening, because on the outside of the Gilded Age, everything looked shiny. So to find out what was really happening, the corruptions and the scandals, they needed someone to expose these problems. And this group of investigative journalism. Muck is a word to mean like when you're cleaning out a stable. So it would be like horse excrement and straw mixed together would be muck, and then you would use a rake to rake this up, and obviously it would smell bad. So the other journalists published these stories because people bought the newspapers to be shocked. So it was like selling scandal, and exposing things. Some famous muckers are Damaris Lloyd, who exposed oil and railroad monopolies; Lincoln Stevens, who exposed Boss Tweed; Ida Tarbell, who exposed the Standard Oil Trust, and these were published in newspapers. These early successes, including the success of McClure's magazine, early success led to more sensationalized and more exaggerated reporting, and it even led to the publication of some super famous muckraking books, including Jacob Riis's How the Other Half Lives, that exposed the horrible living conditions in the tenements in big cities; Lincoln Stevens, The Shame of Cities, that also exposed the problems of urbanization; Frank Norris, who wrote The Octopus, which exposed the underhanding dealings of the railroad monopolies. He also wrote one called The Pit, which involved the grain trusts. And then probably the most famous is Upton Sinclair, who wrote a novel called The Jungle, which was about the meatpacking industry, which we'll learn about further later. Political reforms in cities and states. It starts, this is where the progressive movement starts, in the cities and the states, and then it's going to become national when Teddy Roosevelt becomes president. So what they really focused on is they focused on voter participation. Reforms to increase the participation of citizens in the democratic process. The democratic process just means voting. So they want to focus on voting, and this is what they're going to do. So one thing they do is the Australian secret ballot. By 1910, all the states started printing ballots and marking choices in a private booth to reduce intimidation and bribery. Prior to this, the political machines would print ballots, and then they would watch the immigrants that they had bribed to make sure that they voted for the right person. So by taking away this ability to intimidate and bribe people, you're going to get rid of a lot of corruption right away. Not all of it, but a lot of it. The direct primaries. This places the nomination process in the hands of the citizens, the party bosses. So instead of the party bosses picking who's going to run, this allows the citizens to decide who wants to run. So again, getting rid of corruption. The direct election of senators. This is actually becomes the 17th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Voters choose senators instead of being appointed by state legislators. Fun fact, students, this was one of the reforms that the Populists wanted in their platform, in the Omaha platform. We're going to finish up with 3 things that all gave more power to the people. So it was initiative, referendum, and recall. Initiatives allowed citizens to propose new laws, so they could actually, like, if you wanted to have a law, you could write it up, and then you got your names on a petition, and then the legislators would vote on it. Referendum, citizens could vote on laws, so a lawmaker could write up a law and then propose it, put it as a proposition, and then all the people would vote on it. And then finally, recall. Citizens can vote to remove politicians from power. So let's say that someone got elected and then they did something bad. The citizens could petition to get a recall election, and they could remove that person from office. Next up is municipal reform or city reform. We got Mayor Samuel Golden Rule Jones. He's from Ohio. He wanted the city to control the public utilities such as water, sewage, trolleys, and power plants. Cities all around the country start using this idea to get us away from private companies who are overcharging the citizens. Commissions and city managers, new types of city government to replace political machines. As they're trying to fade out political machines, they're trying to replace them with something that will work to provide goods and services to the people. So the model that emerges is you elect city council members, and then these city council members hire expert managers to run the various departments of the city. So that's how it works. You hire expert managers. This goes along with the scientific management, which we talked about earlier. Scientific manager, you're hiring experts. State reform, temperance, and prohibition. Temperance and prohibition go together. Temperance is just reducing alcohol consumption, and prohibition is completely outlawing alcohol. So this is a move to outlaw alcohol. It divides the progressive move between wet and dry. Usually it's a division between urban, which was primarily wet, and dry, which was rural. Social welfare. Social reform lobbied for better schools, juvenile courts, liberalized divorce laws, and safety regulations for tenant apartments and for factories. Child labor. Another reform that the progressives really wanted was ending child labor. When they tried to do this, the Supreme Court said that they couldn't because that's restricting people's freedom to work. And so the progressives came up with an idea of requiring students to go to school, or mandatory public education. And this turned out to be the most effective way to get children out of factories and out of mines. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. This was about women's labor. Women were increasingly working in factories, even more than before. So young women were working in factories, in sweatshops, oftentimes making textiles. In 1911, there was a fire, and over 115 young ladies die, and this sparks outrage, and people demand that the government make factories more safe, and also as a side effect, it creates laws to protect women from dangerous jobs. And this brings us to a conclusion of the first half of chapter 21, or the first half of progressivism. In the second half of chapter 21, we'll be learning about how the progressive movement goes national. So instead of city and local governments, we'll be talking about the progressive presidents. Until next time, this has been Mr. B History, and I hope you learned a lot. Remember, like, subscribe, and put in some comments. I love to hear some feedback from the students. And until next time, keep learning, A-pushers, keep learning.